In the winter of 1944, the Allied beachhead at Anzio was one of the most dangerous places in Europe. The landing, launched on January 22 under Operation Shingle, was meant to outflank German defenses south of Rome and break the stalemate in Italy. Instead, it turned into a siege. German forces quickly surrounded the shallow Allied perimeter, turning the flat coastal plain into a killing ground. Artillery dominated everything. Soldiers later described Anzio as a place where the sky itself seemed to explode. Among the thousands of American infantrymen dug into muddy foxholes was a young sergeant named Tommy Reeves. He had grown up far from Italy in the coal country of Kentucky during the final years of the Great Depression. In those Appalachian hills, danger was not theoretical, it was structural. Mines collapsed, gas pockets ignited, light failed without warning. For boys who started working underground before they were old enough to vote, survival depended on senses that most people never fully develop. Down in the mines, darkness was absolute. Lamps flickered and died. Dust swallowed visibility. The only way to move safely through tight shafts was to feel the air shift against your skin, to hear the difference between distant machinery and shifting rock, to memorize tunnel layouts by instinct rather than sight. Reeves learned to measure distance by echo. He learned to recognize when a space was occupied, not because he could see someone, but because sound behaved differently. In total darkness, attention becomes a weapon. You either control it or you panic. When Reeves enlisted in the U.S. Army, he entered a different kind of darkness. The Italian campaign had already consumed hundreds of thousands of soldiers by the time he arrived. The terrain favored the defender, mountains, rivers, and fortified lines that slowed every advance. After the landings at Anzio, German commanders reacted swiftly. Units under General Albert Kesselring sealed the perimeter and positioned artillery observers on higher ground and in concealed vantage points overlooking the Allied beachhead. These forward observers, often called spotters, were the eyes of the guns. In World War II doctrine, artillery was not random, it was precise when properly directed. A spotter would observe Allied troop movements, radio coordinates back to gun batteries, and adjust fire in real time. A few corrections could mean the difference between shells landing harmlessly in open ground or directly into a trench line. At Anzio, the system worked with brutal efficiency. Allied soldiers reported that even small movements during daylight could trigger incoming fire within minutes. Casualties mounted not from dramatic charges, but from relentless, calculated bombardment. Reeves watched this pattern repeat. A patrol would shift positions. Within minutes, shells would walk across the earth toward them. A supply truck would move along a visible track. Artillery would bracket it, adjusting left and right until destruction was guaranteed. The problem was not simply the guns, it was the observers who fed them information. Neutralizing artillery pieces miles away was difficult, but removing the eyes guiding them, that was a different challenge. Traditional responses involved counter-battery fire, or sniper teams tasked with eliminating visible spotters. Yet Anzio's flat, exposed terrain offered little concealment. Any movement toward suspected observation posts risked immediate detection. Commanders emphasized caution. Infantry were told to stay low, limit exposure, and avoid unnecessary risk. The priority was survival until reinforcements and a breakout could shift momentum. Reeves began studying something others overlooked. He paid attention to the rhythm of observation. Spotters, like all humans, had habits. They scanned sectors in patterns. They leaned into binoculars, then lowered them to check maps or radios. Their focus shifted in cycles. Reeves understood attention not as a constant beam, but as a moving spotlight. In the mines, he had learned that people cannot concentrate fully on every direction at once. There are always blind intervals, moments when perception narrows. At first, his observations were quiet. He tracked how long a distant silhouette kept binoculars raised. He noted how often two observers would speak to each other, turning their heads slightly inward. He measured time between adjustments in incoming artillery, estimating when corrections were being transmitted. While others saw random danger, Reeves saw patterns. The idea forming in his mind was simple, but dangerous, that a human attention has seams and that a disciplined soldier could slip between them. The risk was enormous. If misjudged by seconds, the result would be immediate artillery or small arms fire. There would be no margin for error, no dramatic firefight, just a shell landing exactly where he had been seen. By early March 1944, the stalemate at Anzio showed no sign of ending. Allied forces remained pinned, German artillery remained accurate, and frustration simmered along the lines. Reeves had refined his observations into a rough system: timing, angle, posture, distraction. He believed he could approach closer than anyone thought possible, not by outrunning bullets, but by stepping only when unseen. He had not yet tested it fully. Orders emphasized holding position. Initiative beyond assigned patrols was discouraged, but the pattern of destruction continued, and with it the conviction growing in his mind. The darkness of Kentucky had trained him for something few others understood. War had placed him in a landscape where sight ruled survival, and somewhere between those two worlds an unorthodox method was about to emerge, one that would challenge doctrine, defy caution, and depend entirely on a coal miner's understanding of how human perception truly works. By February 1944, the Allied beachhead at Anzio had hardened into a static front line. What was intended as a rapid thrust towards Rome had instead become a shallow perimeter under constant pressure. German forces held the surrounding high ground and key observation points, transforming the open coastal plain into a carefully monitored battlefield. Every vehicle track, every trench extension, every movement after sunrise risked drawing attention, and attention at Anzio meant artillery. German doctrine placed enormous emphasis on coordinated fire. Forward observers operated from concealed positions: farmhouses, church towers, tree lines, shallow ridges, any location offering a view of Allied lines. Equipped with binoculars, range-finding equipment, field maps, and reliable radio communication, these observers served as the precision element of the artillery network. Once they identified a target, they transmitted coordinates to batteries positioned miles away. Within minutes, shells would begin to fall. Adjustments were made in real time: left 50 meters, add 100, fire for effect. Soldiers in the beachhead quickly learned that the first shell was rarely the most dangerous. The first was calibration. The second and third walked toward you. By the fourth or fifth, the pattern was locked in. Dugouts collapsed. Supply dumps ignited. Medical stations were not immune. The flat terrain amplified the effect. There were few hills or dense forests to break line of sight. Smoke dissipated quickly in coastal winds. Movement was visible from farther away than most troops were accustomed to. Reeves paid close attention to the consequences. He noticed that artillery did not fall randomly across the perimeter. It followed activity. When engineers worked on fortifications, shells arrived. When patrols rotated during daylight, fire adjusted towards assembly points. When a truck column hesitated in open ground, ranging shots appeared within minutes. The pattern suggested continuous observation rather than occasional spotting. Intelligence reports confirmed what the infantry already suspected. German forward observers were deeply embedded and highly disciplined. Counter-battery fire was used, but locating a hidden observer with indirect artillery was extremely difficult. Snipers were deployed when possible, yet identifying the precise position of a spotter required exposure. Someone had to look long enough to be certain. That act of looking could itself trigger fire. The frustration inside the Allied lines grew steadily. Infantry commanders emphasized camouflage and concealment. Nets were strung over equipment. Movements were limited to darkness when possible. Yet night offered only partial relief. Flares illuminated sectors unpredictably, and some observers remained active even in low light, using sound and muzzle flashes to estimate activity. The psychological strain was significant. It is one thing to face an enemy you can see. It is another to be watched without knowing exactly from where. Reeves began dissecting the problem in practical terms. If observers were responsible for the precision, then disrupting them, even temporarily, could reduce incoming fire. But how do you approach someone whose entire role is to watch? Traditional infantry movement relied on cover, speed, and suppressing fire. At Anzio, suppressing fire risked revealing your own position and escalating artillery response. Speed across open ground invited detection. Cover was limited and often pre-registered by enemy gunners. Instead of focusing on terrain first, Reeves focused on behavior. From his position, using field glasses when available and naked eye observation when not, he tracked distant silhouettes. A spotter rarely stood motionless. He shifted weight. He raised binoculars for extended intervals, then lowered them. He consulted maps or spoke into a radio handset. When communicating, his posture changed subtly. Attention narrowed to the equipment in his hands rather than the horizon. Reeves noticed something else. Observers did not scan in perfect circles. They favored sectors where Allied activity had been previously detected. Human attention is selective. Even trained soldiers gravitate toward the most probable threat axis. That meant other sectors, though technically visible, received less sustained scrutiny. Not invisible, but less intensely watched. He began timing these intervals, rough estimates at first. 10 seconds of concentrated scanning to the left, a pause, a shift to the right, a lean downward. He matched those cycles with the timing of incoming shells. When artillery adjusted quickly, he inferred that observation was continuous. When delays occurred, he suspected distraction or repositioning. This was not guesswork in the abstract, it was pattern recognition under life-threatening pressure. In the coal mines of Kentucky, he had learned that machinery noise rose and fell in predictable rhythms. You moved when drills roared, not when silence amplified your footsteps. At Anzio, the noise was visual focus. If a spotter's attention peaked in one direction, perhaps movement in another, small, controlled, incremental, might go unnoticed. He shared fragments of these ideas cautiously. Some fellow soldiers listened, others warned him against overthinking a simple reality. The Germans had height and optics. Approaching them was suicide. Orders reinforced caution. Patrols were assigned defined routes and objectives. Straying beyond those parameters without authorization could compromise entire units. The chain of command valued discipline over improvisation. Yet the daily casualty reports told their own story. Accurate artillery was shaping the battlefield more than infantry engagements. Reducing its effectiveness, even slightly, could save dozens of lives over weeks. Reeves became increasingly convinced that the solution did not lie solely in bigger guns or more shells fired in return. It lay in disrupting perception. He conducted small experiments within the safety margins available. During heavy Allied artillery barrages, when both sides were firing, he observed whether German spotters reduced scanning to protect themselves from counterfire. During moments of visible Allied activity elsewhere along the line, he tested minor repositioning in sectors that appeared momentarily neglected. Sometimes nothing happened. No ranging shots, no correction. The absence of response was data. Slowly, a framework emerged in his mind. Observers link artillery to targets. Break that link, and accuracy collapses. But the link is human, and humans, no matter how trained, cannot process every direction simultaneously. There are blind arcs created not by terrain, but by cognition. By early March, Reeves had mapped several suspected observation points across multiple sectors. He understood that eliminating even one would require approaching within close range without triggering detection or artillery. The risk was extreme. Failure would not simply mean his own death, it could expose others if fire followed his movement back to friendly lines. The beachhead remained tense and fragile. Reinforcements arrived, but so did continued shelling. German commanders maintained pressure. Air of holding Anzio pinned served strategic purposes. Within that stalemate, Reeves's focus sharpened. The problem of the spotters was no longer abstract. It was immediate and personal. He had seen too many precise impacts to dismiss the system as unbeatable. What he was assembling was not yet action, it was understanding, a realization that the battlefield was governed not only by firepower and terrain, but by attention itself. If attention could be predicted, it could be exploited, and if exploited carefully enough, perhaps the observers who made Anzio so deadly could be reached without announcing the attempt with a single gunshot. By March 1944, the Allied perimeter at Anzio had become a laboratory of survival. Weeks of bombardment had conditioned soldiers to react instantly to the whistle of incoming shells. Duck, flatten, wait for impact. But for Tommy Reeves, survival was no longer enough. Observation had convinced him that the German artillery network depended on something fragile, uninterrupted human focus. He began refining his theory into a deliberate method. Every observer, no matter how disciplined, operated within cognitive limits. The human brain prioritizes. When scanning a battlefield, it locks onto movement, contrast, and recent activity. It favors what has already proven dangerous. That meant attention was never evenly distributed. It pulsed. Reeves called it, at least in his own thinking, linking to shadow, moving only when the enemy's perception shifted away. The principle was simple. Never advance against a fixed gaze. Advance only during transition, when binoculars lowered, when a head turned, when a hand reached for a radio, when artillery from the Allied side forced a momentary flinch or duck for cover. Those fractions of seconds were seams in awareness. Testing the idea in theory was one thing. Applying it meant stepping into open ground under potential observation. He started small, short crawls during heavy wind gusts that shook brush and canvas, brief movements when friendly mortar teams fired, creating dust plumes that disrupted sight lines. He counted silently, 1, 2, 3. Timing how long distant silhouettes maintained fixed posture before shifting. He realized something critical. Observers were not machines, they fatigued. Hours behind optics strained the eyes. Even the most disciplined soldier blinked, adjusted stance, rolled shoulders. Reeves tracked those micro-movements obsessively. A spotter who consistently scanned left to right might linger slightly longer on one sector before reversing direction. That hesitation was opportunity. When he described aspects of this thinking to superiors, the reaction was predictable. The doctrine emphasized coordination, not lone infiltration. An infantry sergeant was not tasked with dismantling enemy observation networks single-handedly. The risk calculation seemed obvious. If detected, he would draw immediate fire, not only from small arms, but from artillery zeroed onto his last known position. Worse, his attempt could reveal gaps in Allied lines if followed back. Orders were reinforced. Limit exposure. Conduct assigned patrols only. Avoid unnecessary heroics. The beachhead could not afford reckless experiments. Reeves understood the reasoning, but he also understood the cost of inaction. Each day, spotters remained active. Shells landed with terrifying accuracy. Trenches that felt secure were shattered because someone miles away adjusted coordinates by a few meters. What made his method controversial was not aggression, it was subtlety. He did not propose charging observation posts with grenades and rifle fire. He proposed approaching invisibly, step by calculated step, inside the natural blind arcs of attention. It required patience measured in minutes per meter. It required resisting the instinct to freeze in fear or to sprint in panic. It demanded complete trust in timing. He rehearsed mentally before attempting longer movements, visualizing the arc of binoculars sweeping across terrain, predicting when a spotter would glance down at a map, estimating how long radio transmission would hold focus away from the horizon. He mapped likely dead ground, slight depressions, shell craters, scattered debris left by bombardment. The Anzio plain was flat, but not featureless. War had carved shallow folds into it. During one controlled patrol, he pushed the limits further than before. An Allied barrage began, drawing visible reaction from suspected observation points. Through field glasses, he saw a figure drop low, perhaps seeking cover from counterfire. Reeves advanced several meters during that disruption, then froze as scanning resumed. No immediate artillery followed. The silence was confirmation. Movement had occurred without detection. Still, the margin for error was razor-thin. A single misread posture could mean instant correction fire. He studied not just the primary observer, but secondary figures nearby. Communication often required two men, one observing, one transmitting. When they leaned toward each other, their shared focus narrowed. That narrowing created wider peripheral neglect. It was counterintuitive, but measurable. Some fellow soldiers began to take cautious interest, not because they believed in invincibility, but because they had seen the alternative. If artillery remained precise, casualties would continue mounting. Reeves did not claim certainty, he claimed probability, a better than even chance if timing was exact, nothing more. The moral weight grew heavier. Disobeying restrictive guidance was not taken lightly in wartime, yet war also rewarded initiative when doctrine lagged behind circumstance. Reeves weighed the potential outcome. If he could neutralize even one observer without triggering retaliation, the immediate reduction in accurate fire might save dozens. If he failed, he alone would pay the price. By mid-March, the opportunity presented itself. Intelligence suggested multiple active observation points coordinating fire across a sector that had recently suffered severe shelling. Weather conditions offered intermittent cloud cover. Allied artillery was scheduled for periodic harassment fire. The variables aligned in a way that matched Reeves' calculations. He prepared with minimal equipment, nothing that would reflect light or create unnecessary noise. No intention of firing unless absolutely unavoidable. Gunfire would announce presence and summon artillery within minutes. Silence was essential. The objective was not a firefight, it was erasure. The method had matured beyond theory. It was now a structured sequence. Observe scanning rhythm, wait for distraction, advance incrementally, freeze during sweep, exploit communication intervals, close distance, eliminate quietly, withdraw only when attention redirected elsewhere. Each phase depended on the previous one. There was no improvisation once movement began, only adherence to timing. As he moved into position for what would become his first full application of the technique, the scale of the gamble was undeniable. He was betting his life on the predictability of human perception under combat stress, betting that fatigue, habit, and cognitive limits applied even to trained German observers overseeing one of the most critical artillery networks in Italy. Around him, Anzio remained under siege. Shells still fell in other sectors. The beachhead still trembled under pressure. But in one narrow stretch of contested ground, a coal miner from Kentucky was about to test whether darkness had taught him something war itself had overlooked, that every watchful eye, no matter how disciplined, must eventually look away. On March 14, 1944, the morning haze over the Anzio beachhead did little to hide the danger. The flat coastal plain was scarred with shell craters, shattered tree stumps, and abandoned equipment half buried in mud. German artillery had already fired intermittent ranging shots before sunrise, probing for movement. Intelligence and recent impact angles suggested at least 5 active observation points coordinating fire across Reeves' sector. If they remained undisturbed, the day would follow a familiar pattern: spot, adjust, destroy. Reeves moved out with no dramatic announcement, no covering barrage designed specifically for him. The battlefield itself provided the noise. Allied guns periodically answered German fire, and each exchange forced observers to make choices: continue scanning or seek brief cover. Reeves positioned himself inside a shallow depression left by a recent explosion and began the slow work of watching the watchers. Through intermittent glimpses, he confirmed one primary spotter positioned near the remains of a farmhouse wall. The man's posture was disciplined, binoculars raised, slow lateral sweeps, brief pauses. A second figure remained slightly behind him, likely handling radio transmission. Further along the line, additional silhouettes appeared at staggered intervals, separate positions but clearly operating within the same observational network. Reeves did not move at first. He timed the rhythm. The primary observer scanned left for approximately 12 seconds, then shifted right. Every few cycles he lowered binoculars and turned inward toward the radio operator. Those transitions averaged 3 to 5 seconds, short but measurable. The first advance covered less than 2 meters. It occurred during a moment when Allied artillery fired from the rear, sending distant concussion waves across the field. The observer flinched slightly, instinctively lowering his head. Reeves slid forward, then flattened as binoculars rose again. No immediate artillery correction followed. He waited. Minutes stretched. Patience was not optional, it was survival. He advanced again during a communication exchange when both German soldiers leaned close over a map. The movement was incremental, never more than the time window allowed. Each pause required absolute stillness. Even the shifting of weight had to be deliberate, synchronized with distractions: wind, distant gunfire, debris settling. Closing distance did not mean safety. At closer range, peripheral vision becomes more sensitive to motion. Reeves adjusted accordingly, reducing the length of each movement phase. When he reached a crater within striking distance of the first position, he waited for a longer interruption. It came when incoming Allied shells landed nearer than usual, forcing the observer to duck and pivot away from his forward arc. Reeves crossed the final gap silently. The elimination was swift and quiet, designed to prevent any shout or signal. The radio operator reacted too late. Within seconds, the first observation post was neutralized. Reeves immediately shifted position, dragging equipment just enough to prevent its immediate use and ensuring no obvious reflection or movement would betray him. The second position required repositioning across partially exposed ground. Now the risk had doubled. If the other spotters had overlapping fields of view, a single miscalculation would trigger catastrophic response. Reeves resumed timing patterns from concealment, identifying which sectors each observer favored. He noticed a subtle but crucial detail. None of them scanned directly behind their neighboring posts for extended periods. Each trusted the other's coverage. That trust created micro-gaps. He advanced again only when 2 distant observers appeared simultaneously engaged in radio transmission. Communication narrowed their attention forward and downward. Reeves moved diagonally, exploiting terrain irregularities created by shell impacts. Dirt ridges, broken fencing, fragments of masonry all became partial cover. The second and third eliminations followed the same principle: approach during transition, act during peak distraction, withdraw a few meters before the next sweep. There was no gunfire, no grenade blast. Silence preserved uncertainty. From a distance, a fallen observer could appear momentarily prone, still working. That ambiguity bought precious minutes before suspicion could spread. By the time Reeves reached the fourth position, nearly 3 hours had passed. Fatigue threatened precision. The mental strain of constant calculation under lethal stakes was immense. A single lapse of concentration could undo everything. He forced himself to reset, observe first, move second, never reverse the order. At one point, a nearby artillery impact showered the field with debris, temporarily reducing visibility. Rather than freeze in confusion, Reeves recognized the event as opportunity. The observer instinctively turned toward the blast, scanning for counter-battery threats. Reeves closed distance in 2 controlled bursts, each timed to the enemy's redirected gaze. The fifth and final spotter in that sector posed the greatest challenge. Positioned slightly elevated, his vantage point offered broader coverage. Reeves waited longer than before, mapping the extended sweep pattern. He identified a consistent delay. After scanning the far right arc, the observer hesitated fractionally before returning left. It was a fatigue tell, subtle but repeatable. That hesitation became the final seam. Reeves advanced into it, step by measured step, until the gap closed completely. The last elimination ended the local observation chain. Radios fell silent. For the first time in weeks, that stretch of Allied trench line did not receive immediate corrective artillery fire following minor movement. The impact was not theatrical. There was no sudden explosion of cheers. The battlefield simply changed tempo. Ranging shots that would normally arrive within minutes were delayed or fell inaccurately. German batteries still existed, but without precise forward correction, their effectiveness sharply diminished. Reeves did not remain exposed to measure the full statistical effect. He withdrew using the same method, moving only during distraction, freezing during sweeps, until friendly lines absorbed him back into relative safety. The entire engagement had lasted roughly 4 hours. 5 coordinated observation points had been neutralized without a single rifle shot fired to announce the act. Over the following hours and into the next day, artillery in that sector lacked its previous precision. Adjustments were slower. Impacts drifted wider. Whether German command immediately understood what had occurred is unclear, but the local disruption was undeniable. A chain had been broken, not by superior firepower, but by exploiting the limits of human perception under combat strain. For Reeves, the outcome validated the method, but it also underscored its fragility. It depended entirely on timing, discipline, and an almost unnatural patience. One mistake would have ended not only his life, but any possibility of repeating the technique. Yet on that day at Anzio, the coal miners' understanding of darkness and attention had reshaped a battlefield, proving that even in industrial war, survival could hinge on the smallest unseen moment when a watchful eye inevitably looks away.
In the days following March 14, 1944, the change along that sector of the Anzio beachhead was subtle but measurable. Artillery still fell. German batteries remained well supplied and determined, but the precision that had defined previous weeks began to waver. Ranging shots took longer to adjust. Barrages drifted wider before corrections tightened. In some instances, corrections never came at all. Without consistent forward observation, even experienced gun crews were forced to rely on outdated coordinates and estimation. Reeves did not announce what he had done. There was no formal report describing a revolutionary tactic. What spread instead was observation from other soldiers. Certain positions that once triggered immediate fire no longer did. Patrol leaders began noticing brief windows where movement drew no instant response. Word circulated informally that German spotters in multiple locations had gone silent within hours of each other. The beachhead remained dangerous. The larger campaign in Italy was far from resolved. Yet within that persistent danger, something had shifted. A handful of units began experimenting cautiously with similar movement principles, advancing only during distraction, freezing during active scans, treating enemy attention as a resource that could be exhausted or redirected. It was not codified in manuals, it was not officially endorsed, but it existed, passed quietly from soldier to soldier. The broader context of the Italian campaign explains why such innovations often went unrecognized. By mid-1944, Allied command attention was focused on breaking through entrenched defensive lines, coordinating multinational forces, and preparing for operations beyond Rome. Individual acts that did not produce dramatic battlefield footage or clear enemy body counts rarely reached high-level reports. Success measured in reduced casualties or disrupted coordination was harder to quantify in the moment. When the Allies finally broke out of Anzio in May 1944 and advanced toward Rome, the campaign narrative centered on operational maneuver, armored thrusts, and strategic outcomes. The grinding siege phase faded into a chapter summarized by dates and troop movements. The men who endured weeks of bombardment returned to being anonymous components of larger formations. Reeves continued serving through the remainder of his deployment. There is no evidence of a formal commendation tied specifically to eliminating observation posts without gunfire. In a war defined by massive offensives and industrial-scale destruction, quiet precision did not always command attention. Decorations often followed visible heroism under fire, not the absence of fire made possible by stealth. When the Allies finally broke out of Anzio in May 1944 and advanced toward Rome, the campaign narrative centered on operational maneuver, armored thrusts, and strategic outcomes. The grinding siege phase faded into a chapter summarized by dates and troop movements. The men who endured weeks of bombardment returned to being anonymous components of larger formations. Reeves continued serving through the remainder of his deployment. There is no evidence of a formal commendation tied specifically to eliminating observation posts without gunfire. In a war defined by massive offensives and industrial-scale destruction, quiet precision did not always command attention. Decorations often followed visible heroism under fire, not the absence of fire made possible by stealth. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, millions of American servicemen transitioned back to civilian life. Reeves was among them. He returned to Kentucky, to the same coal country that had shaped his instincts years earlier. The mines still required men who could navigate darkness and danger. The shift from artillery-scarred plains to underground tunnels was less dramatic than it might seem. Both environments demanded discipline, awareness, and acceptance of risk. He did not write memoirs. He did not lecture on battlefield psychology. Those who knew him after the war described a man who worked steadily and spoke little about Italy. This silence was not uncommon. Many veterans of the Italian campaign carried memories they chose not to revisit in detail. The beachhead at Anzio had left physical and psychological marks on thousands. Yet the principles Reeves applied did not disappear. Modern military training increasingly emphasizes understanding enemy observation cycles, exploiting attention gaps, and synchronizing movement with distraction. While such concepts evolved across decades and through contributions from many sources, the core insight remains constant. Warfare is not only about firepower and terrain, but about perception. Disrupt perception, and even superior weapons lose part of their edge. At Anzio, artillery effectiveness depended on a human chain, observer to radio to gun crew. Breaking that chain required more than counterfire. It required entering the mental rhythm of the observer and moving within its limitations. Reeves' experience in coal mines had conditioned him to trust senses beyond sight, to measure time in echoes and subtle shifts. On a battlefield dominated by optics and range tables, that background proved unexpectedly decisive. The estimated reduction in artillery accuracy in his sector did not appear in bold headlines. It manifested in trenches that were not destroyed, in patrols that returned intact, in medical tents that did not fill as quickly. The number of lives indirectly preserved can only be approximated, inferred from the drop in effective corrections over subsequent days. War rarely records the casualties that did not happen. By the time historians compiled official accounts of the Italian campaign, attention focused on strategic breakthroughs and command decisions. The granular reality of how certain sectors survived prolonged siege remained embedded in unit memories. Reeves' actions became part of that quiet layer of history, acknowledged informally, undocumented formally. His story illustrates a broader truth about conflict. Innovation often arises at the lowest levels, where survival pressures are most immediate. A sergeant in a foxhole can perceive patterns invisible to higher headquarters. When doctrine fails to address specific threats, adaptation fills the gap. Sometimes that adaptation is loud and explosive. Sometimes it is silent. Reeves' legacy, if it can be called that, lies not in medals or citations, but in the demonstration that human attention is finite, even in war. The 5 spotters eliminated on that March day represented more than individual adversaries. They were nodes in a system that assumed constant vigilance. By exploiting natural limits, fatigue, habit, divided focus, he exposed a vulnerability in that system. After decades underground in Kentucky and years removed from Europe's battlefields, Reeves reportedly maintained the same habits he had always possessed, moving carefully in low light, listening before stepping feet, pausing before turning corners. For him, these were not heroic traits, they were practical ones. The Anzio beachhead is now a chapter in military history, visited by scholars and remembered in archives. The fields where artillery once bracketed trenches are quiet, but the lesson endures beyond geography. In every conflict where observation guides fire, the battle for attention continues, and somewhere within that contest lies the same narrow seam Reeves trusted in 1944. The brief, inevitable moment when even the most watchful eye must shift, blink, or look away.